Hi, friends. Current Events is back after a nice little break. My name is Bethany Benz Whittington. I am a PCUSA pastor and teacher, and this is a series all about what's happening in our world and our communities today. It's sermon ish, but probably some things your own pastor won't say. This week, we're talking about apocalypse. It's relevant for two very specific reasons, very different reasons. The first is First Sunday of Advent, which is always apocalyptic. The second reason is, again, Israel. We'll get into why that is. But first, go ahead and read together this week's gospel lectionary passage, which is Mark 13, verses 24 through 37. Then come back and we'll get started. All right, so apocalypse. Yes? The word apocalypse comes from the Greek word apokalypto, which just means I reveal. The book of Revelation is in Greek apokalypsis. And I tell you all of this not because I find word studies all that interesting, which of course I do, but because it's important to know the actual definition of the word apocalypse when we try to have this conversation. Now, over the last 100 years or so, evangelicalism and fundamentalism in Christianity have been mainstreamed. This means, in a lot of ways, many of the more pernicious parts of those traditions have become part of our secular norms. An apocalypse is one of the more virulent and pervasive. There's a book series that came out in the 90s that really sped this up, and if you've heard of it, it's called Left Behind. And of course, more recently, the esteemed Kirk Cameron has starred in the Left Behind movies. The premise of these books is that the apocalypse has happened and a whole bunch of people were left behind to fend for themselves on the hellscape that is now Earth. And friends, this is complete bananas. It has no basis in biblical literature. It is simply a fictionalized version of the hellfire and brimstone that preachers have been preaching for however long. They will tell you that it's based on the book of Revelation, but it's just a really warped understanding of what that book actually says. What's interesting, though, is some of the parallels that we do find with the book of Revelation throughout the New Testament, some of which is coming from this first Sunday of Advent. This is divine revelation from Jesus, telling us a little bit about the end times, if you will. Essentially saying, be on the lookout for all this stuff, but also you're not likely to ever see it, but still be prepared. That be prepared bit is what actually matters in this passage, not all the other stuff. Jesus is using some really vivid language and imagery in order to drive home his point. You don't know when the second coming of Christ will happen. So, further, if we wait until we see the signs and then start acting like true disciples, so Jesus will see us doing it, we've really lost the thread on what it means to be Christians. So, therefore, do the thing Jesus has been telling us and showing us how to do all along. Love one another all the time. That's it. Plain and simple. Don't do it just because Jesus might see you doing it and you get all the heaven points, right? Do it because it's what's right. Then you will be properly prepared for the coming of Christ. That's it. Now, over time, poor exegesis, or lack thereof, honestly, has led us to this place where we take all of these revelations very literally to mean the sky will turn red and fall down and the four horsemen of the apocalypse will come barreling in and all that. In reality, any apocalyptic writing is only meant for the people it's written to give them comfort, knowing that in their persecution, the persecution they are currently living through, for instance, under Roman rule, that God is with them. What happens though is over time, someone reading this apocalyptic literature, let's say 2 millennia later, they don't really understand those struggles, especially a 21st century Christian. We don't really get persecution, 21st century white American Christians. And so we start to take this as like a roadmap for what's going to happen, as opposed to hearing, comfort, comfort you, my people, right? We don't understand it as a metaphor for God's provision. We understand it as a prediction of the future. And this is where Israel comes in. There's a very specific interpretation of many apocalyptic texts that we kind of smush together, including Daniel, Ezekiel, Deuteronomy, and of course, Revelation, that have led certain sects of Christians to believe that in order for the second coming of Christ to happen, the rule of Jerusalem by Jews must be restored. Now, this does come from some scriptural, prophetic, apocalyptic writings. The problem is, what we've just talked about is that prophetic and apocalyptic are not meant to be predictors of the future. They are meant to be comforters of the current people who are suffering under persecution. Now, this is a deeply dangerous thread to pull on, because what has happened as we have started to say that Jerusalem must be controlled by the Jews in order for the second coming of Christ to happen is it has meant the destruction of other people, supported by Christians and Jews, purportedly supported by Scripture, in order to facilitate the second coming of Christ, in order to usher in the end times. Even after Jesus has said, we won't know when it's happening, we still try to predict it, or in some cases, force it. Christian Zionism is what this is called, and it has been rejected by everyone from the Pope to Eastern Orthodox Christians to the Church of Scotland, the National Council of Churches, the PCUSA, the UMC, the RCA, the Mennonite Church, the UCC. It's not terribly mainstream, but also it is. So the biggest problem that I, a layperson in this area, see when we move into the practical application of Christian Zionism is that it hurts people. Palestinians are dying because of it daily for 75 years, and it is deeply anti-Semitic. It actually rejects the validity of Jewishness, saying once the second coming happens, Jews will either convert to Christianity or go to hell. That is not loving, that hurts. So Christian Zionism is actually Christian supremacy at its worst, and it is based on this misinterpreted, misrepresented passage of scripture called Apocalypse that is really just Jesus telling us to have hope and to love each other. It is stunning to me that we have come this far, that we are able to pit scripture against scripture and choose the one that hurts, or choose one and interpret it in a way that hurts, instead of going the helping, loving direction. When in fact, both kinds of scripture, apocalyptic and the sayings of Jesus, are only meant to create beauty and goodness in this world. We are only meant to be helpers, as the Reverend Fred Rogers used to say. So I know that's a lot. It's a lot for you to digest. I have been ruminating on this one for a while, and honestly, I'm glad to have it at least this little bit out of my head. I hope it's been helpful because, again, all I want to do, based on my understanding of scripture and discipleship, is to help. It's the whole reason that I became a pastor. Now you've got a discussion guide in the video description. Good luck and peace. I will see you next time.